Oxygen systems. You need to take out your topic outline and take copious notes. After you're done, I recommend that you fill out the yellow practice questions in preparation for an in-class quiz and, of course, the last test. If you have questions as we go along, I recommend that you make an asterisk next to the item that you have questions about and draw a line to it, and then send me an email or ask me questions in class. Okay, oxygen systems. You need to do the Boeing 777 oxygen and emergency equipment computer-based training program, answer the questions in the topic outline, and make sure that you can answer similar questions to that in the topic outline homework on the next test. Characteristics of oxygen. Oxygen, when combined or in close, when it touches something that burns rather easily, for instance oil or grease, it tends to catch on fire spontaneously. In particular, liquid oxygen touching grease or oil will definitely catch on fire without a separate ignition source. So working around oxygen, you need to be careful about that. Aviators breathing oxygen, the big difference between it and medical oxygen is that medical oxygen can and does have some water vapor in it. Aviators breathing oxygen has zero, has none. Essentially, if you had water in the lines going from the oxygen tank to your regulator and your mask, and you were at an altitude where it was below the freezing point of water, excuse me, the water vapor might freeze and restrict the line or clog it up completely, and then you wouldn't get any oxygen. So aviators breathing oxygen has no water vapor in it whatsoever. There are several types of chemical storage, or correction, oxygen storage systems. Essentially, there's the chemical, the gaseous, the liquid. First, we're going to talk about the chemical oxygen system. It has several other names. It might be called an oxygen candle or a solid oxygen system. You're going to find chemical oxygen systems are made up of sodium chlorate. When you get sodium chlorate to decompose, it burns and it does make some heat, although it's typically not excessive, and it decomposes into oxygen and sodium chloride, or table salt. And it's this gaseous oxygen that you're going to use to breathe. One of the big advantages of the chemical oxygen system or oxygen candle is that it can sit and it doesn't leak. It's not like it's pressurized. So it can sit and sit and sit. It has a very long shelf life. You can install it in an airplane. Typically you'll find chemical oxygen systems or solid oxygen systems on transport category jets for the passenger emergency oxygen system. And this is very convenient since it's got a long shelf life. You just open the overhead panel and there it is, yay, and you don't have to refill it. The negative or disadvantage to chemical oxygen systems is that once you get it started decomposing, you cannot turn it off. It's going to run until it burns out, and it doesn't last very long. But hey, that's okay. If you only need 10 minutes of oxygen to get from altitude down to 10,000 feet as a passenger in a transport category airplane, then a short burn time of 10 minutes is really okay. And like I said, you're going to find oxygen candles in transport category jet airplanes. If you've ever been in an airplane and a transport category jet and you've seen the flight attendant describe what to do about when the oxygen masks fall down, essentially that always says put it around your mouth and tighten up the mask, and then pull on that invisible, that clear tubing. And what that does is it pulls a pin, and there's a striker, and it catches the solid. So like a little flint, like on a lighter, except instead of that oxygen candle, sodium chlorate catching on fire. Well, I guess technically you could argue it catches on fire, but it burns really, really slow, decomposes. And so that's why you get some heat. It's actually decomposing. And of course it turns into oxygen and sodium chloride. Gaseous oxygen systems are storage systems that keep the oxygen in the aircraft in a gaseous state or in a vapor, but it's still at high pressure. Typically older systems that have walk-around bottles where you can walk around the cabin, like for the flight attendants, the yellow, if you see a yellow-colored oxygen tank, that means it's low pressure, and it's only good up to about 450 psi. Of course, it's not going to last too long. The green tanks go all the way up to 2,400 psi, and this is typically what you're going to see nowadays. Even with a walk-around bottle for a flight attendant, it'll be a very small green tank, maybe a foot long and a couple of inches in diameter. It seems rather heavy because it has to withstand quite a few psi there, up to 2,400. And you can either have the portable ones where you walk around with them, and other portable types would be ones you could rent or buy to put in or to carry with you in a general aviation airplane, a piston-powered airplane, say with turbocharging in it, and you would set it somewhere in this airplane, and you can take it from airplane to airplane. And then there's the permanent type, where the system is bolted down in the airplane and you can't remove it. In fact, if you turn the page, you're going to see a diagram. This is for a Beechcraft King Air, essentially a small version of a Beech 1900, and the oxygen tank is after the aft pressure bulkhead, and you can see where the places are where you can plug in oxygen for the passengers. And also on the side of the aircraft is going to be the filler nozzle, and there's going to be a pressure gauge. And yeah, this is a permanently installed gaseous oxygen system. The other place you're going to find gaseous oxygen systems is on transport category jets, big biz jets, and big turboprops for the pilots. They're going to have a gaseous oxygen system. Typically for the passengers, it's the oxygen candles, and for the required flight crew, it's a separate system that has a gas. The storage system is gaseous oxygen. So, in addition to gaseous oxygen systems found in transport category jets, big biz jets, and big turboprops, you'll typically find gaseous oxygen systems on small turboprops and small business jets that are bolted into the system, just like that King Air I just showed you. And you will also find gaseous oxygen systems in piston-powered airplanes that are turbocharged, or piston-powered airplanes that are turbocharged and pressurized, such as a large piston twin that's pressurized like a Cessna 421, a Cessna 340, a P210. I don't know if they made any pressurized Bonanzas. And then the carry-around portable ones, which you can take into any small piston-powered airplane. Liquid oxygen systems, also abbreviated capital LOX or pronounced LOX. LOX stands for liquid oxygen system. The only place you're going to find liquid oxygen systems are in military aircraft. If you're flying along in a transport category jet, big biz jet, or turboprop that's pressurized and you lose pressurization, you're going to descend down to 10,000 feet or so, and then you're going to stay there. It's typically not that critical. You're going to land at the nearest airport probably. But if you're a military aircraft, say for instance you're flying a B-52 from North America to a godforsaken communist country, and if you lost pressurization and you didn't have that much oxygen and you had to descend down to 10,000 feet, jet engines and the airframes they're bolted to don't get very good gas mileage at 10,000 feet. So you really need to stay at that 35 or 38,000 feet, whatever it is. And to do that, you're going to need enough oxygen on board the airplane, so everybody has enough oxygen to stay at altitude the whole time. So on military airplanes, you're going to see liquid oxygen systems so that if they depressurize, everybody goes on oxygen, and you have enough oxygen for the entire crew for the entire flight, and you do not have to descend because you're going to run out of oxygen. We're not going to get into details, but it's typically a spherical container painted green, and it's liquid oxygen. Of course, you need to let it go from a liquid to a gas before you breathe it, otherwise it would be really, really cold. There are essentially two kinds of oxygen regulators. There's the continuous flow, and then there's the demand regulator, sorry. The continuous flow is called continuous flow because the oxygen goes to the mask all the time, or it's a steady rate. The oxygen doesn't start and stop. Even when you're not breathing in, oxygen is going towards the mask. There's essentially two ways to operate continuous flow masks that are found on general aviation airplanes. You're going to find these continuous flow masks on those portable gaseous systems that you rent or buy and jump into your turbocharged airplane. so you can go above, 12,500 feet or whatever it is. And it's either going to be manually set, for instance, there might be a knob, and there might be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and you would set the knob to whatever altitude you're flying at, and it would increase the amount of oxygen that you would get. And then there's the automatic. Of course, when you set it to 25, you get more oxygen. If you had an automatic type, it has a barometer inside of it, and it's going to, as it measures the altitude or pressure inside the cabin, and that gets to a higher and higher and higher altitude, or you could say a lower and lower and lower atmospheric pressure, it's going to send more oxygen to your mask. Now, continuous flow regulators are only going to be used in airplanes whose maximum certificated altitude is flight level 240, that is 24,000 feet. So if you're flying along in an airplane and it only goes up to flight level 240. For instance, the place you would find this would be turbocharged, that is piston-powered airplanes, either pressurized or unpressurized, and really small turboprops and small business jets that only go up to flight level 240. So actually, let's just delete that really small business jets. There are some turboprops that are only certificated up to flight level 240, like those Beech 1900s you see. Those airplanes are only certificated up to flight level 240. So what you could say one way would be any aircraft whose maximum certificated altitude, that's not ceiling, maximum certificated altitude is flight level 240 or lower, and that would be piston-powered airplanes that are turbocharged and small turboprops. If you look at the approved flight manuals for these airplanes, the pressurized piston engine jobs and the small turboprops, it's going to say don't fly higher than flight level 240, and that's not because the airplane won't fly higher than that, but that's all they've certificated the pressurization system for, so you can maintain 8,000 feet inside the cabin, but the differential pressure can only be about 5 psi or so, and on the outside of the airplane it's about 6 psi, 11 on the inside, differential pressure, cabin differential pressure of about 5 psi. So on those airplanes, you only need a continuous flow regulator because you're going to be breathing in some of the cabin air, but if you're only up to flight level 240 and you get some oxygen in some cabin air, you're still going to maintain useful consciousness. The other kind of regulator is called a demand regulator. Demand regulators are used with masks that fit over your mouth and seal around your mouth and over your nose. The first kind of demand regulator, well, they're called demand regulators because instead of having oxygen flowing all the time, demand regulators only send oxygen to the mask when you're breathing and inhaling. As soon as you exhale, it stops sending oxygen to the mask. There are two basic types of demand regulators, diluter demand and pressure demand. First, I'll go over diluter demand. Diluter demand oxygen regulators. Here's what they look like. This picture is not in your topic outline. There's actually 3 switches. This first switch has an on and off position. Most of the time you leave it on. The oxygen supply either gives you normal or 100%. I'll get into that here shortly. And then the test switch goes from test to normal and emergency. You have to hold it spring-loaded to normal, or rather, let me rephrase that. If you push it to the test mask and let go, it'll go back to normal. You can also push it and it'll go to the emergency position and stay there. From sea level to 10,000 feet, you're going to get just air. If the cabin goes above 10,000 feet, you're going to start needing some oxygen, and it will dilute the cabin air, or dilute the oxygen with some cabin air. And the higher and higher you go, cabin altitude, the less and less cabin air you breathe, but the more and more oxygen you breathe. It doesn't pull in outside air from the airplane. It lets you breathe cabin air plus oxygen. The closer and closer you climb in cabin altitude to 34,000 feet, the more and more oxygen you get and the less and less cabin air you get. As you go over about 34,000 feet cabin altitude, the regulator will start only giving you oxygen. And as you continue past 34,000 feet, you'll continue just getting oxygen. Now, this switch position is normally going to be in the on position, and normally you're going to leave the switch position down here in normal. If you move the switch lever to 100% oxygen, then no matter what altitude the cabin is at, even all the way down to sea level, oops. If you move the supply switch from leave it in normal, it's as I just described. From 0 to 10,000 feet, you're going to get just cabin air. From 10,000 feet to cabin to 34,000 feet cabin, it's going to slowly increase the percentage of oxygen that you're breathing versus cabin air. So by the time you get to 34,000 feet, you're going to be breathing 100% oxygen. If you continue to go above 34,000 feet cabin altitude, it will continue to give you just 100% oxygen. However, if at any time you rotate this supply switch and flip it up to 100%, no matter what altitude you're at, whether it's sea level 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40,000 feet, it's going to give you 100% oxygen. Now this whole time, it's only going to give you oxygen and or oxygen and air, or just cabin air, at the cabin pressure. So if you go up to 40, these systems are only good to 40,000 feet, because above 40,000 feet cabin altitude, even if you're breathing 100% pure oxygen, it's not enough pressure to push oxygen across your lungs into your bloodstream. So a diluter demand regulator is only good up to 40,000 feet. Now, what you can do is, regardless of where these switch positions are, if you go to test mask, it'll blow air in your mask. Most of the time you leave it on normal. However, if you push the switch up to emergency, then what it's going to do, it's going to push 100% oxygen to your mask, and it's going to push it at a little bit higher pressure than cabin pressure. For instance, if you had smoke in the cockpit, you wouldn't want to inhale and get a little smoke. So this, if you went to emergency, it's going to pump oxygen to your mask, 100% oxygen, at a little higher pressure than cabin, and oh wait, it doesn't wait for you to inhale. It blows air, oxygen, 100% oxygen to your mask all the time. Unless you go to the emergency position, it's only going to give you what you ask for when you inhale. That's why it's called a demand regulator. The pressure demand regulator looks identical. It looks just like this one does. Looks just like that. Oops. Looks just like that. And it uses a mask that needs to fit over your mouth and your nose and seal, just like a diluter demand regulator needs a mask that'll fit over your nose and your mouth and seal. And it works identically to the diluter demand regulator all the way up through and including 40,000 feet. Again, from 0 to 10,000 feet cabin altitude, if you've got it on normal, it's going to give you, at cabin pressure, just air. From 10,000 to 34,000 feet, it's going to be giving you more and more oxygen, so by the time you get to 34,000 feet cabin altitude, it's going to be giving you 100% oxygen. And from 34,000 feet to 40,000 feet, if you're in the normal position, it's going to give you 100% oxygen. But if you have a pressure demand system, unlike the diluter demand, which doesn't give you enough oxygen above 40,000 feet, the pressure demand system, if your cabin goes above 40,000 feet, it actually, whenever you inhale, gives you pressurized 100% oxygen that's at a higher pressure than cabin. So if you're above 40,000 feet, you got a pressure demand mask on with a pressure demand regulator, and it's in a normal position, then it's actually going, and you inhale, it's going to actually push 100% oxygen into your lungs, and you're going to actually have to use muscles in your chest to stop the air, the oxygen, from getting into your lungs. Don't worry, it's not strong enough it's going to blow your lungs up or anything, but you're actually going to have to use muscles to push and stop the oxygen from coming into your lungs. When you usually breathe, you use muscles to inhale, and then you relax to let air out. When you're using a pressure demand regulator above 40,000 feet, it has to be the other way around. You don't use any muscle. As soon as you start inhaling, it inflates your lungs with 100% oxygen at a higher pressure than inside of the cabin. And then you actually have to use your chest muscles to constrict them to stop the oxygen and then push the oxygen out. You actually have to use your chest muscles to push air out. It's pretty fun. If you had to do it for a long time, you'd get kind of tired. So from 0 to 40,000 feet, the diluter demand regulator and the pressure demand regulator both work the same. And above 40,000 feet, the pressure demand system pushes oxygen into your lungs at a pressure that is higher than cabin pressure. And when I was in the Air Force, it said don't fly the airplane above 50,000 feet ever, whether it was pressurized, even when it was pressurized. If you ever look up a thing called the Armstrong line, if you ever do a Google search on Armstrong line, you're going to find it's at 64,000 feet. And the higher you go in altitude, or the lower the pressure you're exposed to, your blood boils, water boils at a lower and lower temperature. And at 64,000 feet, the pressure is so low, water will boil at 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So if you're above 64,000 feet and you depressurize, all the liquid water in your body starts trying to turn into vapor, and it expands like crazy. And in fact, the expansion rate ratio from liquid to vapor of water is 1,700 to 1. So the water liquid in your body will attempt to expand and turn into a vapor and expand to 1,700 times its original size. So I encourage you not to have a depressurization above 64,000 feet unless you're wearing a spacesuit, which is if you flew an SR-71 or a U-2, that's what you did. Okay, who uses diluter and pressure demand regulators? Any aircraft that is certificated to fly above flight level 240 up to and including flight level 400. That's any airplane whose maximum certificated altitude is above flight level 240 up to and including 400. That's 24,000 feet to 40,000 feet. If it's above 24,000 feet, then you're going to need a diluter demand regulator. However, if your airplane whose maximum certificated ceiling is above 40,000 feet, for instance, brand new big Learjets, Bombardier Challengers, Grumman Gulfstream 5, those are airplanes that are certificated up to 51,000 feet. Hey, they're certificated above flight level 400, above 40,000 feet. So they are going to have pressure demand regulators. So any airplane whose maximum certificated altitude, not how high it could fly, but how high it's certificated to fly, if its maximum certificated altitude is above 40,000 feet, it is not going to have a diluter demand regulator, it's going to have a pressure demand regulator. So if you depressurize above 40,000 feet, you'll have a system that will work and keep you usefully conscious. Now there's essentially three kinds of mask. If you have a continuous flow regulator, you can use a continuous flow mask. Typically, these are if you've ever seen those yellow margarine cup looking parquet things, when you fly an airliner, there's a bag attached to it. The oxygen coming from the oxygen candle is actually pumped into the rebreather bag. When you exhale, some of your exhalation, some of the air you breathed out actually goes into the bag. So when you inhale, you get in some oxygen that, I think that's the next slide. You get some oxygen that was in the bag, you get some air that you're going to rebreathe, some old air, and if you inhale enough that the bag is emptied, you're also going to get cabin air. So it's possible when you're using the continuous flow mask with a continuous flow regulator, or a continuous flow mask would be used with an oxygen candle, and it's got a rebreather bag, then you're going to be breathing in oxygen, you're going to be rebreathing your air that you exhaled, and you're going to be breathing in some cabin air. Fortunately, there's only two places you're going to find these continuous flow masks. One of them is on transport category airplane emergency passenger systems, because those people only have to stay alive and stay conscious. They don't have to be useful. They just have to stay alive and stay conscious. Or you're going to find them on airplanes that are certificated up to and including flight level 240. 24,000 feet. An airplane that's certificated above flight level 240 is going to end up using a demand type of a mask. Also, if you're using a continuous flow regulator on these small general aviation airplanes, a cannula, it's a little tube-like device that goes under your nose and a couple of lines point up, and you keep your mouth shut and you inhale through your nose. It's kind of like those things you see emphysema patients on, or if you go to the hospital and they give you oxygen these days. If you keep your mouth shut, the little tube just blows oxygen in your nose, and when you inhale, you get outside air or cabin air and oxygen, and it's called a cannula, and you're only going to find those on general aviation airplanes that are certificated up to and including flight level 240. And then demand masks are going to be used only on aircraft with diluter demand or pressure demand regulators. They, of course, those regulators are going to be found on airplanes that are certificated above flight level 240. And like I said before, they have to fit tightly around your mask and your nose so that you're not accidentally breathing cabin air, because sometimes you need just the 100% oxygen. The flight crew are the only ones that are going to get these demand masks, and when I say flight crew, that includes the flight attendants. You're also, in case there's smoke in the cabin, you're going to want a face mask or goggles. The older systems typically have goggles that are separate from the oxygen mask. Newer systems, you pull a face mask over your entire face, so if you went to emergency and you blew oxygen into your mask, it would get rid of any smoke that was in front of your eyes, or at least inside of the mask. Anyway, that way your eyes aren't messed up in case there's smoke. When you're pre-flighting the system, you're going to check the pressure gauge. Depending on if it's a gaseous system, obviously, that's the one you're going to be checking for. If the temperature of the oxygen is cold, it'll read lower. If the temperature of the oxygen is higher, it'll read higher. So there's typically a temperature correction chart to make sure you have a high enough quantity. You're going to check the masks and hoses for condition, make sure they're not broken or kinked. And me personally, if it's a mask that somebody else might have used, I'm going to go to Walmart or Kmart and buy that little box of alcohol swabs that you can tear open and just take one out, and I'm going to clean it off in case they got some goobers on it or something. I won't have to get any germs from them. Now, remember I said at the beginning about oxygen being spontaneously combustible with things that burn easily. Guess what? Makeup, a lot of them are petroleum-based, and a lot of chapsticks are petroleum-based. Guess what? Petroleum is flammable. So if you're going to be using an oxygen system, or possibly using an oxygen system in case of an emergency, you need to make sure that if you put anything on your face, it's not flammable. Because if you blow up your oxygen on it and your face catches on fire and have petroleum jelly on your lips because you have chapped lips, it's going to be you're going to be really unhappy when your face catches on fire. So when you start flying airplanes that are pressurized, or you're going to start using an oxygen system, you need to make sure that anything you put on your face, including chapstick, is not petroleum-based. Now, on the general aviation airplanes, you're going to maybe be involved with servicing the oxygen tank. You do not need to memorize these MIL spec numbers, these military spec numbers. MAL-00 is for oxygen. You don't have to memorize those numbers. Essentially, if it's got a MIL spec number or it says aviators breathing oxygen, you're going to be okay, because essentially this means no water vapor. Now, whoever is servicing the system, they need to be using tools that don't have any oil or grease on it, because if oxygen gets blown on it, it could catch the oil and grease on fire. When I was in the service, we worked on Northrop T-38s, little two-seat pilot trainers, and then they had a liquid oxygen system. And we actually had special tools that we kept locked up in a plastic bag, and the only time we ever took these tools out was when we were going to work on the oxygen system, and we made sure never any oil or grease got on them, because if they did, we could have a fire. So if somebody's, you also need to do it in a well-ventilated area. So if some $5.15 an hour, ground person is servicing your airplane and they're using greasy tools, you need to ask them to stop and get other tools. And just wiping it off with your rag isn't good enough. If you can't get them to stop, maybe you need to leave the area so you don't catch on fire when they do. If you go to pre-flight the airplane and the pressure on the gauge reads 50 pounds per square inch, 50 psi or less, Since these gauges are not that accurate, you have to assume that the tank is empty. Now the downside of this tank being empty is that if you're at altitude and it goes empty and you descend, it's possible that air goes back through the lines into the oxygen tank. Well, if air gets into the oxygen tank and there's water vapor in it, now you've got water vapor in your oxygen tank, and if you go back and fill it up with new oxygen and there's water vapor in there, it might freeze and clog up some of your oxygen system. So if it's less than 50 psi, you're going to need to have the tank purged. They're going to blow nitrogen in it, fill it up with nitrogen, and let the nitrogen out, and the air and the water vapor come with it, and then put oxygen back in. So you're going to try not to let the oxygen go below 50 psi if possible. If you have any questions about oxygen systems, please send me an email or ask me in class.